Everybody. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Rebecca. As Rebecca noted so eloquently, I founded and am the Dean of Lamdeinu, which is an institute for advanced, accessible, and hopefully inspiring Jewish text study. We're based in Teaneck, New Jersey, but since the pandemic, we Zoom worldwide. It's an honor to join you this evening and to share some words of Torah and reflection. As a young woman, I studied and practiced American law. After the birth of my daughter, who's the second of my three children, I transitioned to my vocation and avocation as a Torah teacher. I spent 17 years at the DrishaInstitute for Jewish Education in New York City. And about 9 years ago, I founded Lamdeinu and have the joy of teaching and learning at Lamdeinu every day. I thank you, Dr. Rebecca Sipis and the Sipis family and the committee for inviting me to participate in your very special program, the Orthodox Forum program, and for being so helpful in every way. Thank you so much to all of you. The title of my shiur this evening, and as Rebecca and I discussed, this is a shiur, although I hope it will open up larger issues. The title of my shiur is Through the Prism of Law and Narrative, Yibbum, Chalitzah, and the Biblical Woman. I chose this topic for a number of reasons. First, and perhaps most obviously, it's relevant to the Torah reading that we read this morning on Shabbat, specifically the story of Judah and Tamar. Second, and this was my deeper motivation, as committed Jews in the 21st century, we tend often to focus on keeping 613 commandments in our daily lives with intent and with dedication. Often, however, and I speak for myself only, we don't have time to think about the deeper meaning and messages of our Torah way of life. To me, connecting the laws of the Torah to the stories of Sefer Bereshit and to the stories in Tanakh as a whole is the key to understanding the moral values that are at the foundation of Judaism. To this end, the example that I will ask you to think about this evening is the case of Yibbum and Chalitzah, levirate marriage and the rejection of levirate marriage, as it's described in Sefer Bereshit, in Sefer Devarim, and also in MegillatRuth. I used to think of Yibbum as a somewhat dry, technical, and even archaic rule that is only practiced today in the breach. As many of you are aware, Masechet Yevamot of the Talmud, which I must underscore is beyond the scope of our shiur this evening. Masechet Yevamot largely focuses on chalitzah, that is how a man and woman can get out of a Yibbum situation when it's halachically required. Interestingly, Israeli cinema has taken an interest in this topic, both in documentaries and as the basis of a number of dramatic series, which appeared in the movies and on Netflix. So we know we're dealing with an important topic. But what I believe we in the 21st century often neglect to recognize and acknowledge is that one of the few of the 613 commandments that we see our ancestors practicing, albeit in a modified form, in Sefer Bereshit is Yibbum. In the book of Bereshit, which lays out the moral values that are the foundation of the family and nation of Israel, it is striking that the practice of Yibbum was so prominently featured in our Torah reading this Shabbat morning. I therefore hope to demonstrate to you this evening that far from being an archaic relic of ancient common law, the biblical practice of Yibbum is a key to understanding God's fundamental directive to Avraham Avinu and to all of us, that we create and preserve a society of tzedek umishpat, a society that is built on the principles of justice, the rule of law, and the protection of its weakest members. As God states in Sefer Bereshit, in Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Yutet, Bereshit 18:19, regarding Abraham, Ki yidativ leman asher yitzavet banav et beito acharav, v'shamru derech Hashem lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. God announces that his relationship with Abraham is to the end that he may command his children after him to keep the ways of tzedakah and mishpat, to keep the ways of righteousness and justice. And with that introduction, let's move on to our shiur this evening. Yibbum. Yibbum, or levirate marriage, refers to a union between a man and the childless widow of his deceased relative, arranged for the purpose of producing a child. The English word levir, L-E-V-I-R, comes from the Latin term that means brother-in-law. The Hebrew description of this practice are forms of the root yud bet mem. So let's get our terms straight. Yibbum is the act of levirate marriage. Yivama is the childless deceased widow. And the miyabein is the man who is supposed to marry the childless deceased widow. Through the process of Yibbum, the child of this union between a man and his deceased brother's widow, the miyabein and the yivama, is intended to provide an heir for the dead brother and also to take care of his widow and her child. In addition, the practice of Yibbum also assured men in society that their lineage and memory would continue after their death, even if they died childless. So as an aside, there's considerable evidence that Yibbum, or levirate marriage, was practiced both in ancient Israel and in other ancient cultures. Hittite laws and Middle Assyrian laws describe the practice of giving a childless widow to a deceased man's brother or other male relative. Different societies consider different male relatives as qualified levers. In some, only a biological brother was qualified, while in others, any male relative within a larger kinship constellation was a possible miyabein. So let's move to our primary focus this evening, the role of Yibbum in the Torah and in Tanakh. Only two texts in the Torah explicitly deal with the obligation of Yibbum. They are, one, the story of Judah and Tamar in Bereshit 38, that you saw earlier. And the second is the legal discussion of Yibbum and Chalitzah in the 25th chapter of Sefer Devarim, verses 5 through 10. The first appearance of Yibbum in the Torah is in Bereshit 38, which we read this morning. The story of Judah and Tamar is source number 2 in your source sheets. And I ask you to open up to those source sheets. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. Should we put it here?
They didn't.
Just leave it. Okay, they probably got it already. Okay, so I ask you to look at your source number 2, which is Bereshit Lamechet, and we're going to focus on verses 2 through 11. I will read the verses in Hebrew. Please follow in English or any language that you prefer, but it's useful to focus on the language. So I'll do the dramatic reading. Vayhi ba'et hahi vayered Yehuda me'et echav, vayet adish adulami u'shemo chira. Vayar sham Yehuda bat ish Kenani u'shemo Shua. Vayikacheha vayavo eleha. Vatar vatelet bein vayikra et shemo er. Vatar od vatelet bein vatikra shemo onan. Vatosef od vatelet bein vatikra shemo shela. V'haya bichsiv bilidita oto. Vayikach Yehuda isha le'er b'choro u'shma Tamar. Vayihi er b'chor Yehuda ra be'enei Hashem vayimitehu Hashem. Vayomer Yehuda le'onan bo eleshet achicha v'yabemota v'hakem zera la'achicha. Vayeda onan ki lo yiyeh hazara. והיה אם בא אל אשת אחיו ושיחת ארצה לבלתי ניתן זרע לאחיו. וירא בעיני השם אשר עשה, וימת גם אותו. ויאמר יהודה לתמר כלתו, שבי אלמנה בית אביך, עד יגדל שלה בני, כי אמר, פן ימות גם הוא כאחד, ותלך Tamar ותשב בית אביה. Okay, so Yehuda marries a quote-unquote Canaanite woman. Many of the commentaries dispute the fact that the woman is Canaanite and suggest that Canaanite denoted a merchant in the Bible. So I will mention that. Her name is Bat-Shua. Yehuda has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. When dies, Yehuda wishes to provide an heir for his, get it, heir. My husband made that joke earlier. Okay, never mind. It was good. It was good for a quiet Shabbos lunch. Got it here. Okay. So dies, and Yehuda wishes to provide an heir for his deceased son. Therefore, younger brother Onan accepts the responsibility of having relations with Tamar, but he deliberately avoids impregnating her with a child. The pshat, the plain sense of the text, does not indicate anything about marriage. It appears, however, that Onan does not want to father a child that will be credited to his deceased brother, He therefore performs what seems to be coitus interruptus or some kind of unnatural act. The commentators have different opinions, and God is angry with him, and he dies as well. So now, when Onan dies, the Yibbum responsibility, and the word Yabein actually appeared in verse 8 that we just read together, the Yibbum responsibility falls to Shelah, the youngest son. But fearing that Tamar is somehow the cause of his son's deaths, and a number of the commentaries actually think that they believed that Yehuda believed that she was the medical cause of his son's deaths, Judah avoids having his youngest son take her and impregnate her. Now, it's clear from the Torah text that a child of the union of Tamar and Shelah as a miyabein would have been considered the child of the deceased brother This is the premise of Yibbum. But things go awry as the story progresses. Tamar waits in vain for Yehuda to fulfill his promise to give her Shelah, the youngest brother, in Yibbum, in levirate marriage. When a long time passes and Tamar sees that this is not happening, and this is in your source sheets in chapter 38 of Breshit, verses 12 through 30, you can take a look at it as I summarize. When Tamar sees that the Yibbum with Shelah is not happening, she veils herself and places herself strategically in Judah's path, ba'einayim. And there are all kinds of fun commentaries on the words ba'einayim. Technically, it probably means in the crossroads, and there are suggestions by ancient Near Eastern scholars that prostitutes often hung out in the crossroads where people could see them clearly with their einayim. So thinking that Tamar is a prostitute, Judah purchases her services and unknowingly impregnates his own daughter-in-law Tamar with twin sons. And when Yehuda hears later that his daughter-in-law is pregnant, he presumes she must have committed adultery and declares that she be sentenced to death by burning. But then, through a messenger, Yehuda is confronted with evidence that Tamar is actually carrying Yehuda's own offspring. And when he confronts that reality, Yehuda declares in Perek Lamdchet Pasuk Chafav, which I believe I gave you somewhere, yes, in your source number 2. Vayaker Yehuda vayomer tzadka mimeni, ki al kein lo netatiha l'shelah v'ni, v'lo yasaf od l'data. And Judah acknowledged the presumably seal cord and staff, which was the collateral that he had given Tamar as part of the deal for having relations with her, he promised to give her the Yibbum in the future, but the collateral was sealed cord and staff in the present, in the verses that you can review on your own. Yehuda acknowledges the sealed cord and staff and said, Tzadka mimeni, which technically probably means she is more righteous than I, because I gave her not to Shelah, my son. We tend to think of the word tzedek and sadiq today as righteousness. In the Bible, in its original meaning, it probably refers to a courtroom situation. You're matzdikat hatzadik and marshiyat harasha. So the technical meaning of tzadka mimeni is Tamar is more righteous than I. I came across recently the Targum translation, which I thought was so fascinating, of tzadka mimeni, and apparently the Targum has some kind of a break between tzadka and mimeni, and the meaning it suggests is that she is so deket because the baby is mimeni. Okay, which I thought was very interesting. I have to say that I thank all of you for inviting me to speak here, because I hadn't noticed that one before. You can look at the Targum. In any case, this complex story concludes with what seems to be a positive outcome from the biblical perspective. Tamar gives birth to twins named Peretz and Zerach. The book of Ruth later clarifies that Peretz, the son of Tamar Yehuda, is the direct ancestor of King David, right? So Tamar is thus the mother and Yehuda is the father of the Israelite monarchy. And you can see that in your source number 3. The Eila Toldot Peretz, yada, 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 at the end of MegillatRuth, the Oved holid et Yishai, the Yishai holid et David. So in the story of Yehuda and Tamar, the institution of Yibbum seems to do its job, so to speak. It serves to correct the seeming injustice in society. Yibbum guaranteed that the Yevama, or surviving wife, would be assured of sustenance and physical protection by her deceased husband's family. The Bible frequently speaks of the challenges of widowhood. Yibbum is thus a way in which a childless widow's place in society is secured so that she can receive the support that she needs. And finally, in this story, Yibbum accomplished the more mystical goal of assuring that heir's lineage and memory would continue even though he had not produced an heir. So in summary, the story of Yehuda and Tamar suggests that Yibbum is a tool of tzedek, or justice, in ancient society. In the Bible, Yibbum is the corrective to the early death of a man without heirs. Yehuda's declaration, Tzadka mimeni, I would argue, is more than a statement of relative morality in this specific situation. Rather, it provides a larger perspective on how the human system of Yibbum, levirate marriage, restores the status quo of a just society, even when tragic events like the premature death of a husband interferes with the expected life trajectory of his wife and family. Interestingly, this is so even at the possible cost of the seeming violation of incest taboos. In this case, the marriage of Yehuda, who's a father-in-law to his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And if you look at Sefer Vayikra, you'll see the list of proscribed relations. You can certainly argue that this is only if the father-in-law and son are, father and son are both alive, but you can look at the verses in Vayikra Yitchet, Tetvav and Tetzayin, Ervat Kalatecha lo tegale, Eshet Bincha hi lo tegale Ervata, Ervat Eshet Achicha lo tegale Ervat Achicha hi. So there certainly is the possibility that there were expanded incest taboos of this nature in the ancient Near East. Moving on in the Torah, Sefer Dvarim also describes the ceremony of Yibbum, but in a very different textual medium. Dvarim Perek Chaf-Hei, Psukim Hey through Yud, Dvarim 25, 5 through 10, offers a detailed legal treatment of Yibbum, of levirate marriage. And I ask you to look at your source number 4. Let me go there. Yes, okay. I'll just read it. Please follow along as you're comfortable. Ki yeshvu achim yachdav umet achad mehem uvein elo lo tiyeh eshet hamet hachutza leish zar yivama yavo aleha ulekacha lo leisha v'yidma v'haya habachar asher teled yakum al shem achiv hamet v'lo yimachesh shemo miYisrael. Ve'im lo yachpot ha'ish lakachat et yevimto, ve'al ta yevimto hashara el hazdekenim, ve'amra me'en yivami lahakim la'achiv shem b'Yisrael, lo ava yabni. Ve'karu lo ziknei iro ve'dibru elav, ve'amad ve'amar lo chafatzti lekachta. V'niksha yivimto elav le'enei hazdekenim, Chalitzah na'alo me'al raglo v'yarka b'fanav. Ve'anta ve'amra kacha ye'aseh la'ish asher lo yivneh et beit achiv. V'nikra shemo b'Yisrael beit chalitzahin. So this passage from Sefer Devarim reframes the practice of Yibbum in a number of respects. First, the obligation of levirate marriage falls on the deceased man's brother. There's no mention of a more expanded kinship constellation, such as a father-in-law, which was the case in the story of Judah and Tamar. Furthermore, Devarim prescribes a process of release from levirate marriage, that is, of course, Chalitzah. The process of Chalitzah is initiated at the discretion of the intended miyabim, the deceased man's brother, but it's performed publicly by the widow and the intended miyabim, the Yibbum refuser, if you will, through a ritual in which both publicly declare that the man refuses to perform Yibbum on his predeceased brother's wife. The widow removes the sandal of the refuser, of the Yibbum refuser, spits in his face and declares in Chapei Tet, Ve'anta ve'amra, and it sounds like Purim language, but it's not, Kacha ye'aseh la'ish, asher lo yivneh et beit achiv. Finally, the Yibbum refuser's family is dubbed thereafter Beit Chalitzahin, or the house of the unsandaled one. Since he refused to build up his brother's house, this pejorative nickname will presumably degrade his own household. As an aside, it's clear that the purpose of the widow's spitting is to humiliate the miyabim for refusing to perform a duty that's important for his dead brother's legacy. Similarly, the expression Beit Chalitzahin is probably not a compliment. It implies a punishment that suits the crime. Since the brother refused to build up his brother's house, his new nickname degrades his own house. What's less clear is whether the significance of removing the sandal or the shoe is necessarily negative. It is very common for legal transactions to be accompanied by symbolic acts, and the widow's removal of the brother-in-law's sandal may symbolize the cession to the widow of his claim upon her. There are similar procedures. There's a procedure practiced in ancient Germany, which also marked the giving up of inherited rights and property by removing a shoe. There's also a Bedouin divorce formula that declares, "She was my slipper. I have cast her off." The present ceremony could possibly likewise symbolize the renunciation of a marriage, in this case, in advance, a marriage that would never happen. When I was in 8th grade in the Torah Academy for Girls in Far Rockaway, Teaneck, as it's called, we were assigned to do a skit. The class was divided into groups. It was a small school then. There were only 20 something of us. Now I hear it's huge. It has a swimming pool, but this was a long time ago. So we were divided, and my group had to do Yibbum and Chalitzah. So I remember the most important prop was in Chalitzah, when the man took off his shoe, we started spraying Lysol all over the room. So you can picture it in whatever way you are most interested and comfortable. I believe that the institution of Chalitzah in Sefer Devarim serves to reinforce the importance of Yibbum as a protective ritual for widows, while acknowledging its pitfalls in real human experience. Sometimes the goal of tzedek must be balanced against the trauma of family discord. The purpose of Yibbum is to repair the lines of continuity that result from a man's death without children and to secure the status of his childless widow. It's evident, however, that a Yibbum, that a levirate union can at times create tension because it imposes a too great personal or economic burden on the potential miyabein, or because it unites a couple that isn't otherwise appropriate and suited to each other. So chalitzah is the exception that strengthens the rule by providing a technical way out when Yibbum interferes with family harmony. Chalitzah is, if you will, the solution to the solution. Chalitzah addresses the possible distaste of Yibbum to actual human beings and families. And of course, the Mishnah and the Gemara Masechet Yevamot further refine the parameters of Yibbum and Chalitzah in later times to address the cases, especially in which it's not desired by the parties involved. And that's, of course, beyond the scope of what we'll talk about this evening. The final possible example, and I am, saying possible, the final possible example of Yibbum and Chalitzah in the Bible is not in the Torah, but rather in Ketuvim, in the book of Ruth. Most ancient and modern interpreters, with Rashi and Ibn Ezra as notable exceptions, assume that the marriage between Ruth and Boaz is a case of Yibbum, a levirate union. If you take a look at your source 5, I gave you Ruth 3, 6 through 9, and also Ruth 4, 1 through 12. You can peruse through that. Many scholars believe that in Ruth Gimel Tet, Ruth 3, 9, Ruth is basing her request of Boaz for redemption. Remember, on the threshing floor, she's basing her request of Boaz for redemption on the assumption that Boaz is a goel or redeemer who must redeem Ruth and Naomi's land through levirate marriage. And so Ruth stealthily approaches Boaz when he's asleep on the threshing floor, and they have the following exchange. You can take a look at 3:9. I think I gave it to you. Vayomer mi'at vatomer anochi Ruth amatecha ufarasta kinafecha al amatecha ki goel ata. When he says, "Who are you?" she answers, "I am Ruth, your maidservant. Spread your skirt over thy handmaid, because you are a potential redeemer, a near kinsman, if you will." That's an interesting translation, as an aside. Goel is redeemer. I guess it's based on the discussion of Gula in Vayikra Kafei Kafei. I will just say that the language ufarasta kinafecha al amatcha is language of marriage. We see it also in the 16th chapter of the book of Yecheskel, in the description metaphorically of God marrying the nation of Israel as part of the covenant at Mount Sinai. Further evidence that Ruth is a Yibbum or a Yibbum-like situation is drawn from chapter 4, verse 5 of MegillatRuth, where Boaz declares that the redemption of Ruth by Ploni Almoni. Remember Ploni Almoni? It's amazing. I've been to a lot of brisses, and I never heard the name Ploni Almoni. So the relative, Ploni Almoni, is the relative with the first right of refusal for marriage of Ruth and acquisition of her husband's family property. And if you look at the language, the suggestion is that this would have served lahakim shem hamet al nachlato. That is, to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate. So if you look at your source number 6, Boaz states, Vayomer Boaz, this is Ruth 4, 5 through 6. Vayomer Boaz, Biyom kinotcha hasadeh miyad Naomi, ume'et Ruth hamoaviyah eshet hamet, Kanita lehakim shem hamet al nachlato. Vayomer hagoel lo ucha legol li, pen ashchit et nachlati, ga'alacha atat geulati, ki lo uchal ligol. So if you remember the Hebrew phrase lahakim shem, to establish the name of the deceased husband, that appears here in the ceremony between Boaz and Ploni Almoni, that very phrase lahakim shem also appears in an identical language in the legal passage in Devarim Chafhei Zayin. And furthermore, in the 4th chapter of MegillatRuth, Boaz strategically describes 2 aspects of the Redeemer's, the Goel's duty as a Goel. It's both the redemption of land and levirate marriage to Ruth. Boaz emphasizes this double duty to induce Poloni, the potential redeemer, the Goel, to cede his redemption rights and responsibilities to Boaz. And Boaz is indeed successful. Poloni is concerned that taking Ruth as a wife would interfere with his existing nachala, his inheritance, and perhaps his current family equilibrium. And finally, the narrative in Ruth, chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, which I gave you as source 6, clearly and definitively evokes the description of Yibbum and Chalitzah rituals in Dvarim 25. And you can take a look again at your source 6, verses 5 through 10. Vayomer Boaz b'yom kinotcha sadeh miyad Naomi u'me'et Ruth haMoaviyah eshet hamet kanita lahakim shem hamet al nachlato. Vayomer hagoel lo uchal ligol pen ashchit et nachlati ga'alacha atat gulati ki lo uchal ligol v'zot lefanim b'Yisrael al ha'geula va'al ha'timura lekayem kol davar shalaf yishna alo v'natan l're'ehu v'zot ha'teuda b'Yisrael. Vayomer hagoel leBoaz kinei lecha vayishlof na'alo. Vayomer Boaz lazakedim v'chol ha'am. Edim atem hayom ki kaniti et kol asher leElimelech v'et kol asher lechilyon u'machlon miyad Naomi v'gam et Ruth haMoaviyah eshet machlon kaniti li leisha lahakim shem hamet al nachlato v'lo yikaret shem hamet me'im echav u'mishar mekomo edim atem hayom. So this is clearly a ceremony. And it seems in many ways in language to parallel the ideas not only of redemption of land, but also of levirate marriage. And perhaps the most striking proof that this is a Yibbum-like situation is the allusion in Ruth 4:12 to the personalities Yehudah, Tamar, and Peretz. So if you look at verse 12, Vihi Beitcha kaveit Peretz asher yalda Tamar lihuda min hazera asher yitain Hashem lecha min hanara hazot. The allusion to Yehudah and Tamar in this verse strengthens the argument that following the Chalitzah ceremony with Ploni Almoni, Ruth and Boaz have a levirate marriage. So where does all this leave us? I would suggest that the very fact that a version of Yibbum and Chalitzah is the medium that moves the plot of the story of Ruth and Boaz to its positive conclusion speaks volumes about the symbolic significance of these rituals in biblical times. In the book of Ruth, Chalitzah and Yibbum are the vehicles for correcting a societal injustice and restoring the desired status quo. There's much to be said about how the story of Ruth is a literary redress or tikkun of the earlier biblical story of Yehudah and Tamar. The core value of Yibbum as a societal practice that protects the wife and family and lineage of a man who dies without an heir is already present in the story of Tamar and Yehudah. But the story of Ruth revises some of the less savory aspects of the story of Yehudah and Tamar in Bereshit 38. And I'll mention 2 examples as they're most relevant to our shiur this evening. First of all, By arranging to be married to Boaz, rather than simply having relations with him, Ruth, with the guidance of Naomi and the consent of Peloni and the support of Boaz, is able to create a legal and public redemption of her deceased husband's name and property. Interestingly, by doing so, she also enables Boaz to metaphorically cleanse the line of the tribe of Yehudah from the more questionable conduct of Yehudah in his interactions with Tamar in Sefer Bereshit. There's much more evidence of this, but that will be beyond our discussion tonight. Second of all, by treating Ruth with respect and dignity in the private and public spheres through Yibbum, through levirate marriage, and redemption of the land of her dead husband, I believe that Boaz actually and symbolically reverses the pattern of subjugation of women in the era of the judges, in the era of Shoftim. The book of Ruth, and I gave this to you as source number 7, the book of Ruth opens with the words Vayehi bimei shepot hashoftim, and it came to pass in the period when the judges judged. This is the period after the conquest of the land, but the period before the monarchy. By starting with these words, Vayehi bimei shepot hashoftim, the book of Ruth calls attention to the historical context of the story, this era of the judges. The era of the Shoftim in ancient Israel was in many ways a time of anarchy and social disorder. Most notably, it was a time when women were subject to the sometimes unchecked and improperly utilized power of their fathers and brothers and husbands. And two striking examples from the book of Shoftim are, first, the sacrifice of the daughter of Yiftach, a judge general, which results from a careless vow that he makes before going out to war. And you can look this up, of course, on your own in chapter 11 of the book of Shoftim. And second, the rape and mutilation of the concubine of a man from the tribe of Levi while traveling in the territory of Binyamin in the story of Pilegesh Begivah, which appears in the closing chapters of the book of Shoftim, chapters 19 through 21. Like the book of Ruth, the story of the concubine of Givah, Pilegesh Begivah, opens with a reference to the era before the monarchy. And that's, of course, the era of the Shoftim. And it describes the treatment of a woman from Beit Lechem, Yehudah, which of course is also the home of Naomi and Boaz and Ruth. You can see the excerpts from the story in, I believe I gave you in source number 7, which parallels the beginning of Ruth. Vayehi bimei shvot hashoftim vayira'ah ba'aretz vayelach ish mi Beit Lechem Yehudah to vayehi bayamim hahen umelech ein b'Yisrael vayehi ish Levi gar b'yarketei har Ephraim vayikach lo isha pilegesh mi Beit Lechem Yehudah. But the similarities between the two stories, Ruth and the concubine of Givah, are superficial. Pilegesh Begivah is a Sodom-like narrative. A man from the tribe of Levi travels with his concubine, who is from Beit Lechem, Yehudah, and stops in the town of Givah, which is the territory of the tribe of Binyamin. The two stay over in the house of an old man, but the Israelite men of Givah, recalling the non-Israelite men of Sodom in Sefer Bereshit, demand that the old man bring out his guest so that they can sodomize him. Instead, the guest seizes his own concubine. His own Pilegesh sends her out to the mob who rape and abuse her all night until dawn breaks. And you can see the language in source number 8 describing this scenario if you look at verses 25 through 30. I believe that in MegillatRuth, Boaz, who hails from Beit Lechem in the territory of Yehudah, symbolically purges the violation of the Pilegesh in the story of Pilegesh Begivah, who is similarly from Beit Lechem Yehudah, in this troubling story that is recounted in the closing chapters of Sefer Shoftim. The language and thematic similarities between the two stories are striking, while the contrasting outcomes seem intentionally jarring. In the story of Pilegesh Begivah, the solution to the tragedy of an oppressed Israelite woman, in this case, her horrific rape and mutilation, is the drawing of swords, Sholef Cherev, in a civil war between the tribes of the nation of Israel. So if you look at your source number 9, you'll see the description of the civil war between the tribes of Israel that results from this horrific incident. If you look at verse 15 and 17, describing the gathering together of the army of Binyamin against the other tribes, Vayitpakdu b'nei Binyamin bayom hahu, mei ha'arim 26,000 ish sholef cherev. The children of Binyamin, the soldiers of Binyamin, numbered 26,000 men that drew their sword. The Ish Yisrael hitpaktu, this is verse 17, Levad mi Binyamin 400,000 ish sholef cherev. And the men of Israel besides Binyamin were 400,000 men that drew their swords. And I want you to notice the words sholef cherev, drew their swords. In the book of Ruth, however, Boaz, who is similarly from Beit Lechem, Yehudah, deals with the tragedy of poor and widowed women, Ruth and Naomi, not with force, but with due process in a public forum. This is precisely the redemption process that is described in the 4th chapter of MegillatRuth, verses 7 through 8. So if you look at source 10, V'zot lefanim b'Yisrael al ha'geula v'al ha'timura lekayem kol davar shalaf ish na'alo v'natan l're'ehu v'zot ha'tuda b'Yisrael. This was the custom in former time in Israel, concerning redeeming and concerning exchanging, to confirm all things. A man drew off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was the attestation in Israel. So the near kinsman Ploni Almoni, in the ceremony in which there is redemption and possible levirate marriage, possible opening the door to levirate marriage of Boaz and Ruth, the statement is Vayomer Hagoel leVoaz Kinei Lecha Vayishlof Na'alo. The near kinsman says to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and he drew off his shoe. So note the language in the end of Sefer Shoftim, repeatedly Sholef Cherev. Note the ceremonial language in the story of Ruth, which also occurs in the period of Shefot HaShoftim, Vayishlof Na'alo. The language similarity is unmistakable, and the message is even more powerful. In organizing and overseeing the ceremonies of Chalitzah and Yibbum, in Ruth chapter 4, verses 7 through 8, Boaz is Sholef Na'al rather than Sholef Cherev. By using this language parallel, MegillatRuth suggests that in performing the ceremonies of Chalitzah and Yibbum, Ruth and Boaz are together negating the anarchy and repression of women, I believe, in the era of the judges, in the era of Shefot HaShoftim. And the ultimate and highly positive consequence of their conduct from the biblical perspective is that Boaz and Ruth prepare the line of Yehudah for the advent of King David, as we read in the closing verses of MegillatRuth. So in summary, read together and in light of each other, the laws of Yibbum and Chalitzah in Dvarim 25, and their practical enactments in the story of Judah and Tamar, and finally, in the story of Ruth and Boaz, teach one of the most crucial messages of the Bible. Yibbum and Chalitzah are not simply vessels of an antiquated system of common law. Rather, Yibbum and Chalitzah and Tanakh symbolize the role of tzedek u'mishpat, justice and the rule of law, in organizing Israelite society. They symbolize the superiority of the rule of law over military coercion and over socio-political oppression. In the Bible, the possibility of human dignity and a kind and just society is expressed through the practice and symbolism of the ceremonies of Yibbum and Chalitzah. And perhaps this idea is hinted at in the very root of the word Chalitzah, chet lamed tzadi. The root in the Bible is most often related to the plunder of war or to a military procession, as in chalutz, right? Chalutz l'man avodah zum gali gali. Or if you look at your source 11, the story of the tribes, B'nai Reuven and Gad, who want to settle on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, but they have to make the commitment, nevertheless, to function as leaders and shock troops when B'nai Israel are conquering the land. And if you look at the language, you'll see chet lamed tzadi. Chet lamed tzadi appears over and over again in your source 11. V'anachnu nechalei chushim im techaltzu lifnei Hashem lamilchama v'avar lachem kol chalutz v'avadecha yavru kol chalitzah lifnei Hashem lamilchama. So most often, chet lamed tzadi in the Bible is a word of war, but in the Torah, chet lamed tzadi is also the root of chalitzah, a mechanism for the resolution of conflict in a peaceful society. The Bible teaches that communal ritual, in some cases creatively administered by individuals and institutions, paves the way for human beings to take care of those in their midst who are in need of sustenance and support. This was evident in the story of Judah and Tamar, and it's even more prominent in the story of Ruth. Boaz carries out his noble intentions towards the impoverished Naomi and Ruth by expanding the sanctioned tradition of the miyabein, or redeeming relative. Ruth's courageous conduct and sterling reputation as an Eshet Chayil and caregiver for Naomi invigorate her cause in the eyes of the Beit Lechem community. And the people of the Beit Lechem community, who seem well aware of the irregular nature of the marriage of Ruth and Boaz, which is evident by their comparison of it to the union of Yehuda and Tamar, nonetheless publicly affirm the marriage. As we read in source 6 earlier in Ruth 4:11 through 12, Vihi Beitcha Kiveit Peretz Asher Yalda Tamar Li'da Min Hazera Asher Yitein Hashem L'cha Min Hanara Hazot. But they also say, Vayaru Kol Ha'am Asher Bashar Vaskenim Edim Yitein Hashem Haisha Haba Al Beitecha Kirachel U'Chileya Asher Banu Shetehem Et Beit Yisrael, etc., etc. And finally, God. And this is so striking, and it's actually unique in the Bible. God places his seal of approval on the process and result by granting Ruth her pregnancy in a unique biblical articulation. If you look at the end of Megillat Esther, chapter 4, verse 13, Vayikach Boaz et Ruth v'tehi lo leisha, vayavo eleha, vayitein Hashem la herayon v'telet bein. God gave her herayon. God gave her conception, v'telet bein. Again, this is not Christianity, so it's a very unique articulation in the Bible, and I believe that it emphasizes to us that God places his imprimatur, his seal of approval, on the sequence of events. So I want to return now to the point with which I began this shiur. The Torah is not just a book of rules. The Torah is a way of life. Laws can be legislated and prescribed, but moral values are inculcated more subtly, and often they're taught most effectively through stories about real people and real life experiences. The vital message, I believe, is also the intent of two beautiful and resonant midrashim in Ruth Rabbah, which I'll close with, and which I cited for you in sources 12 and 13 of your source sheets. First, Midrash Ruth Rabbah 2:15. Amar Rabbi Ze'era, Megillazo ein ba lo tub'a velo tara velo isur velo heter v'lama nichteva lelamedcha kama sachar tov legomlei chasadim. Rabbi Ze'era said, Ruth is not written to teach you the laws of purity or impurity, etc. Why was it written? To teach you the extent of the good reward for those who perform kindness. I've read this midrash 1,000 times. I think its deeper message is exactly what we're talking about this evening. Chazal are alluding to our point precisely. The story of Ruth demonstrates through plot and character development how the seemingly archaic rules of Yibbum and Chalitzah are actually the foundation of a just society, a community of chesed. And when a community acts with chesed, Chazal suggests, it will reap a great reward. And finally, source number 13, Midrash, Ruth Rabbah 7:7, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Boaz Asad Shelo, Ruth Asad Shela, V'nami Asad Shela, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Afani Asad Sheli. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua expounded, Boaz did his, Ruth did hers, and Naomi did hers. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, I too will do mine. If you remember nothing else from the shiur this evening, please remember this midrash and permit me to reframe it in modern humanistic terms. We are meant to be God's partners in creation. That is the message of the stories of Sefer Bereshit, and that is the message of MegillatRuth. What does this mean in practice? We cannot sit back and say, God will take care of it. As human beings, we could not create the physical universe, but we can be God's partners in the creation of a just and moral and caring and giving society. That is what Ruth did. That is what Boaz did. That is what Naomi did. And we are meant to follow in their footsteps and have faith that God will then pave the way for our efforts. And if I may wax a bit sentimental, I would argue that the ability to model tzedek, mishpat, and chesed is also the greatest achievement of the state of Israel. Israel, for example, whenever it's permitted to do so, is the first responder to nations throughout the world who are in need of chesed, whether it's in the form of disaster relief, medical relief, humanitarian aid, technology, and numerous other ways. This is our mission in the Bible. To conclude, I believe that the ceremonies of Yibbum and Chalitzah, with their roots in the story of Tamar and Judah and Bereshit, their legal expression in the laws of Sefer Devarim, and their expanded practice in MegillatRuth are in reality templates for the practice of tzedek, mishpat, and chesed. The book of Ruth, which presents the latest biblical incarnation of the practice of Yibbum and Chalitzah, is at its core modeling a process for human beings to create and preserve a society governed by justice, the rule of law, and the even greater value of chesed or kindness. This is true even though this lofty goal requires Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi to act with courage and creativity. The marriage of Ruth to Boaz and the resulting birth of King David are biblical expressions of the highest honor and accolade. They confirm that the ceremonies of Chalitzah and Yibbum, with its roots in the earlier story of Tamar and Yehudah and the law and Devarim, were practiced in biblical times as vehicles for what my kids today like to call social justice and tikkun olam. I leave you with that thought, and I thank you for being here this evening. It's really been an honor and a pleasure. Okay, I'm happy to entertain questions, thoughts,